Hey guys, this is your tired teacher reporting from school this time. Yeah, let's see how this goes. But alright, today we've got the progressive era, or rather, well, we're not including progressive presidents in this. We're going to include them in the next lecture, but this one we're going to be talking about all this stuff. So, we're going to be talking about prohibition, immigration restrictions, political reform, into white slavery, prostitution and sweatshops, Americanization of immigrants, the end of urban political machines, women's suffrage, the rate regulation of private utilities, antitrust legislation. So essentially, all of the progressive reforms imaginable. Well, anyways, if you're keeping along with the AMSCO book, this is chapter 21 in the 2020 version before they actually redesigned it. So, anyways, without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and fix the problems of the Gilded Age with the Progressive Era. So, here are the years for the Progressive Era. Generally, the consensus is from 1900 to 1920. Reason for 1900s around the time Theodore Roosevelt rises up into power, and 1920 because our last progressive measure, which is women's suffrage, is passed in that year with the 19th Amendment. Okay, let's go ahead and figure out the rest of this. So, what is progressivism? Well, you're kind of making progress. You're kind of moving forward. So, pretty much like how the populist farmers were pushing for reforms, now people in the cities and in local governments, state governments, and even at the national level are pushing for reform. So it's kind of like a culmination of all of that. People are just so pissed off at the Gilded Age. It's yeah, enough's enough. Let's change this stuff. So what they're believing is that government should be more active. Instead of this whole laissez-faire, let's let business do whatever the hell it wants, and hands-off approach with government. No, people are going to be nope. Government needs to have a bigger role in regulating things. And these progressives also believe that social problems should be addressed through government legislation. So again, using politics to go ahead and fix the problems of not only the cities, but problems within corruption, in big business, and even in government by electing progressive-minded politicians. And then public funds should be used to address social problems. So these guys are going to be definitely pushing for that populist measure known as, the graduated income tax, or rather, it's going to become the 16th Amendment. So, progressive reformers, bruh, it's like they took the Populist Party platform and just ripped it off and added some problems of the cities to that. And, yeah. So, all right, our origins of the progressive movement. Well, we kind of saw the undercurrents of it already, with the social gospel movement, settlement houses going on, and this push for good government that we see happening throughout the country. So, with the social gospel, the whole hey, what would Jesus do kind of thing? Well, it's an early precursor of it, honestly, in the simplest of terms. But really, it's kind of hey, we're Christian. let's try to fix up the place and make it to where, we are helping the poor. So with settlement houses, this is more of a charitable act, but it also spurns off the whole social work kind of movement going on to, again, help out the poor. And then good government. Women out west are definitely pushing for suffrage so that they can get involved with government. And it works for them. By about this time in 1900, most of the West has already granted women suffrage. The first being Wyoming in 1869. So women have been voting out west for quite some time. And it shows. Western governments definitely are being reformed at this point in time. So, who in the hell are these progressives? Well, here's the thing. Okay, we're going to draw a lot of comparisons with this movement, the progressive era, versus antebellum reform movements. Because honestly, it's the same type of freaking people involved. You've got mainly the educated urban middle class, okay? That's your first and foremost. And within that group, it's going to be mostly women. Because again, issues like temperance and women's suffrage carry over. So that's your continuity right there. Your change over time would be some of the various issues like, fixing up the problems of the cities, ending the corruption with big business. That kind of stuff would be the new reforms coming out. But essentially, it's motivated by the same things. I mean, you could argue that the social gospel was like the religious aspect of it, kind of like how the Second Great Awakening was a religious aspect of antebellum reform. So, like I said, guys, we're going to make a lot of comparisons to antebellum reform. So, yeah, dude, this would be like DBQ alert, man. For real, they would go here with this, comparing and contrasting the two movements. But anyways, we're going to start to see reform-minded politicians get involved in this, like our boy Teddy Roosevelt. And small business owners as well, because, I mean, come on, they hate the freaking corporate competition. So yeah, they're going to want to clean up the abuses of big business. So, more about who the progressives were. Again, the urban middle class, because they're the ones who see, like, the problems of the cities. They see the rising power of big business. They see the uncertainty of the business cycles with the financial panics that occurred during the Gilded Age. They see this big gap between rich and the poor growing. And, they're seeing the violence that's going on between labor unions and, big business. And, of course, in the cities, they see how corrupt these political machines are and how they're just dominating over the entire city. And even when you consider the South, I mean, they're freaking out at the Jim Crow laws. Because essentially, it's like slavery has returned with systems like sharecropping and tenant farming. And the suppressive Jim Crow laws that essentially make African Americans second-class citizens once more. So the people that will be involved with the progressive movement are Protestant church leaders. See, that's our comparison to antebellum reform. Protestant church leaders. African Americans will also become involved in the progressive era movements, albeit with the African American community, because the progressive era is pretty badass with like reforms and stuff, but one place that it severely lacks is in racial issues. Go figure. We'll address that later on with civil rights, but progressive era stops short of, fixing up the racism problem in America. But we're also going to have labor union leaders involved in the progressive era movement and feminists. So pretty much like all of these reform efforts are going to be lumped into the single label of progressive era reform. And really, I mean, these people were like, dude, society needs a change. And government needs to like step up and correct some of these societal ills, whether they be social or economic. Government needs to like step the hell up. So, for some attitudes and motives of the progressive era, well, the urban middle class, since they do live in the cities, and they're white-collar workers, so they're mid-management professionals and such, they're going to be motivated, and they have the time and the money to do so, especially middle-class women. Because, once again, like in antebellum reform, this is totally in their realm of acceptable behavior in society, to be involved in like the settlement house movement, in temperance, and such. So we also have professionals involved in this as well. So people kind of versed in scientific and statistical methods, basically streamlining everything. And they're finding like new social sciences, kind of like what we talked about with the whole popular culture lecture that we had. Social sciences like sociology, psychology, all that. Plus, They belong to these national business and professional associations that are already wanting to address these problems within big business, within the government, and actually have government step up and, fix these things through legislation. So much like antebellum reform, religion as well plays a huge freaking role in honestly bringing about this change, because there is a religious aspect to it too. I mean, when you're seeing the poor in the cities suffer greatly under the current system, what's one way to actually do the Christian thing? I mean, it's to get involved and to help out the problems of the city, to help out these poor. So the social gospel movement is going to do just that. Urban Protestants are going to be like, yeah, let's help out the poor. This is our Christian duty to do so. So amongst these Protestants, of course they're native born, but also, especially in cities like New York City, they belong to families of the older elites. And these older elites hate these new wealthy people coming out of the Gilded Age. So they're going to hate people like the Vanderbilts. They're going to hate people like the Rockefellers, like the Carnegies, the Jay Goulds. I mean, dude, they hate them. Because to the older, wealthy elites, they're going to be like, yeah, these nouveau riche, wealthy industrialists, dude, they don't like them at all. And they feel like their level in society has been replaced by these wealthy industrialists and the urban political machines. So they're wanting to kind of recapture that old glory, and they do so by participating in progressive era reform. So, more attitudes and motives for the progressive era. Well, we finally got freaking leadership now at the national level and at the state level. So we got very progressive era reform-minded politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, Robert LaFollette coming out of Wisconsin, William Jennings Bryan, who came on the national scene during the election of 1896, and we even have Woodrow Wilson for the Democratic Party. So we also have this whole notion, this belief in pragmatism. So William James and John Dewey are going to be like, hey, the good and the true could not be known in the abstract as fixed and changeless ideas. People should rather take a pragmatic approach, more practical approach to morals, ideas, and knowledge. So they feel that, hey, you want to accomplish these things, we should definitely take a practical approach to all this. So we should experiment with ideas and laws, make sure we test them, and kind of oil up this machine again and make sure it's operating to optimal standard when it comes to government. So they're going to adopt, progressive era thinkers are going to adopt pragmatism because in a way, it's going to shake up the system and kind of, get rid of stuff like laissez-faire where it's like, oh, let's just leave it alone. No, they want a more hands-on approach, more streamlined approach to politics. Get rid of the middlemen like the political machines who are just wasting everything and actually get stuff done practically in politics. So this kind of leans into the whole scientific management thing that came from F.W. Taylor. So Taylor discovers ways of organizing people in the most efficient manner, which he calls the scientific management system. So by applying F.W. Taylor's ideals in this from business to politics, progressive reformers believe that politics could also be made more efficient if placed in the hands of experts and scientific managers. Trimming the fat basically in politics and streamlining the system. So yeah, their big goal is to get rid of those political machines and the party bosses like Boss Tweed. because they feel that their system is very anti-democratic because of the way it was run. There's so much corruption in that kind of system, and it's very efficient in the long run. So, yeah, that's what progressive era reformers are wanting to push. So once again, today we are talking about these reform movements. And in order to understand these reform movements, we need to kind of go back a little bit and review what we had covered during our urbanization part of our lecture a little while back, and see how these progressive era reformers are going to address these very problems of the cities and what they do as a practical approach. So our first big approach that we're going to talk about is the settlement house movement. You guys remember, this started up in the late 1880s, and it's going to continue on through the Great Depression. So mostly it's middle-class educated women and men that volunteered and worked in these settlement houses. And what settlement houses do is, they're going to take a residential building, they're going to convert it, make sure it's situated around poor urban neighborhoods, and really by 1910, this idea takes off. There's 400 settlement houses in the U.S. And what these settlement houses do is to work to improve the lives of the poor families that are around the area by providing different services like, healthcare screenings, childcare, like all of this stuff that the government was not providing to these people. So they have clubs, people can join, classes to learn English and to sew and like to cook and stuff, social gatherings so that people could, hang out and actually have fun, playgrounds for the kids so they have a safe place to play and not in the streets, in the sewers with dead animals around. You're going to have art programs, sports, summer camps, clean milk stations because that is important, baby clinics, and other programs of the sort. So settlement house workers see this as a big mission for social reform. They feel if they could directly help out the poor in this way, they're accomplishing part of the mission, right? So settlement houses are going to be like this sort of progressive era laboratory for developing these new techniques and offering training in the new field of social work. So again, this is when social work starts. So some of the early settlement houses, like this first settlement house in the United States, which was the University Settlement House of New York, it's going to be a school, a community center, research institute, and welfare agency. So things like kindergarten kind of get its start here. It was a German idea, but of course, the settlement house are going to listen to their German immigrants and actually enact it here in the United States. Public baths as well. They're going to volunteer their time and money to run these settlement houses, these progressive era reformers, and then later on, finally, when we start to clean up politics and actually put an emphasis on social welfare and reform, the governments are going to step in the municipal level. But of course, our most famous settlement house comes from Jane Addams when she establishes Hull House in Chicago. So Hull House becomes the model settlement house around the country. And it's a way to help immigrants assimilate into American life, but to also provide these much needed services for them. So here's your inside of Hull House. So you could see the little daycare right there. The common areas and such. And other settlement houses across the country will be the same way, essentially. So this is one way to tackle some of the problems of the cities. So let's review these problems because, they are worth mentioning over again and how we're going to try to clean up these problems as well. So for our problems of the cities, a big problem is the rapidly growing urban areas. Remember, immigration at this time was skyrocketing during the Gilded Age. There's so many people coming to the cities, not only from the farms, but, dude, immigrants from Eastern Europe are coming in, millions of them. And they're settling in these urban areas because that's where the factory jobs are. Or that's where family members are, so on and so forth. So really, with this huge influx of people to the cities, the city governments can't keep up. They can't keep up with housing either. So there's going to be this development of slums, these poor neighborhoods in the cities, which are going to be filled with people, overcrowded, noisy, and when you do get a lot of people in a concentrated area, I mean, there's going to be a lot of disease, there's going to be a lot of crime, there's going to be a lot of like just random trash everywhere. I mean, come on. It goes without saying. But these tenements were built in these poor areas to try to keep up with that housing problem. But these tenements, though, are not up to code. They're not up to standard because, again, there's no regulations going on because the cities are run by corrupt individuals. So these tenements were small, they were cramped, they didn't have adequate airflow, water, or sanitation. So once inside one of these tenements, I mean, that's basically your living space. The whole family in a room. The restroom down the hall, and everybody's got to share it. And if you couldn't afford this, I mean, this was your 5-cent spot a night. It's basically like you're renting out a space to sleep. And look at how crowded and dirty that looks. I mean, it's just crazy how the poor got along in the cities. Because even if you couldn't afford that, I mean, there you are, sleeping side to side in these cots, and, you know, of course, with such close proximity to one another, disease is going to spread, right? I mean, it's just a perfect storm for disease to spread in these poor areas of town because there's poor sanitation already, backed up sewers, it's crowded, poorly ventilated in these tenements, and, of course, diseases such as like yellow fever, cholera, tuberculosis are going to plague these areas. So, I mean, the city problems are massive, and people just don't know about them yet. So we need the media to actually expose these problems of the cities so that the other half, those people in the cities that don't live in these areas, can understand the problem and fight for a solution to it. So, we're going to get newspapers and magazines to expose these problems. Magazines like Collier's, Cosmopolitan. Dude, this is the same Cosmo that does like the quizzes now. It's like, oh, here's your horoscope kind of thing. Yeah, that Cosmopolitan. It used to be legit. So anyways, you have more magazines like McClure's, Scribner's. And the people writing for these magazines are going to be muckrakers. These are the journalists that are going to expose the problems of the cities through their investigative journalism. And I mean, it works. People are going to be exposed to the problems of the cities, the problems in big business and in government through the writings of Lincoln Steffans, Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, or through the photographs of Jacob Riis, which we saw photographs from Jacob Riis right now when we're seeing the pictures of the cities, these poor neighborhoods. He's the one who takes those pictures. So, I mean, the purpose of the Muckrakers is to expose all of this corruption, the problems in the cities, problems in politics, and in economics. So, who they're targeting is going to be like monopolies, trusts, corporations, so big business for sure, in steel and oil and in railroads and in other industries. They're also going to target these political machines and party bosses that run these cities. And, of course, the poor living and working conditions of the poorer members of society, whether it be addressing the tenements and their poor conditions or addressing the poor conditions of labor for them. So, rounding out the list of notable muckrakers, we're going to get John Spargo, Frank Norris, Ray Stannard Baker, and Lewis Hine, who takes photographs of child labor. So, starting off first with Frank Norris. With his book, The Octopus, it talks about the railroads and how it has a stranglehold over the farmers. So this is going to, of course, call for the regulation of railroad corporations. The one that has arguably one of the most impactful books that exposes problems is going to be The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair. It's going to describe the filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry, and it's going to convince Theodore Roosevelt to pass the Federal Meat Inspection Act and subsequently the Pure Food and Drug Act. Because, I mean, dude, Teddy was a beast, but this book even grossed him out. So, let's go ahead and read an excerpt from The Jungle. Old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white would be doused with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had trampled and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip all over it, and thousands of rats would race on about it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over the piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, the bread, and the meat would all go into the hoppers, the grinders, together. The meat would be shoveled in the carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage, in comparison, with which a poison rat was a tidbit. That last line right there is talking about people. Sometimes people would fall into the chutes. You wouldn't be able to hear their screaming because of the loud machinery. So yeah, that's The Jungle. Sorry guys if you're about to eat lunch. Dude, it never fails every year. The class right before lunch hears this, they're like, oh. And they always serve hot dogs that day. Beware, guys. Sorry. Okay. We've already talked about Ida Tarbell. We talked about how she targeted John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil and tried to expose his ruthless business practices that he did amongst the competition to monopolize the oil industry. And again, the octopus is the symbol of Standard Oil, just basically devouring everything in its path, whether it be competition or government. See, once again, the octopus shaped in an oil barrel kind of way, just devouring everything across the globe. So, we've seen photographs from Jacob Riis. His book, where he publishes these photographs, is How the Other Half Lives. And not only do we see photographs of the tenements and how the poor lived, he also writes excerpts in there too. So, some of the photographs are very famous from The Other Half Lives. I mean, look at these photographs. You could definitely see the problems of these poor areas. Problems within the tenements. And I mean, just how destitute these poor people are. So someone who tackles the problems of city government is going to be Lincoln Steffans, who wrote the book, The Shame of the Cities. And he is definitely going to target how corrupt these cities were. So who he targets in particular is going to be city bosses like Boss Tweed. So, Boss Tweed we already hinted on him before, right? I mean, the city bosses are going to be notorious for just widespread corruption. So here's a quote from Lincoln Steffans. "A bribe is bad, that is. It is a bad thing to take, but it is not so bad to give one. Not if it is necessary to my business. Business is not a political sentiment, but our politician has caught it. He takes essentially the same view of the bribe, only he saves his self-respect by piling all his contempt upon the bribe giver. And he has the great advantage of candor. It is wrong, maybe, but if a rich merchant can afford to do business with me for the sake of a convenience, or to increase his already great wealth, I can afford, for the sake of living, to meet him halfway. I make no pretensions to virtue, not even on Sunday. As for giving bad government or good, how about the merchant who gives bad goods or good goods, according to the demand?" So, remember the system of the city bosses. You do have some positives, though. They did help out the immigrant community to find food, jobs, and a place to stay. And this was definitely essential to helping out the cities. They also kind of stepped in to help run the cities and act as that middleman. But while they were doing so, there was widespread corruption by political machines like the Tammany Hall political machine and Boss Tweed, where they did steal the people's tax money through kickbacks and bribes. And these party bosses promoted and protected vices and encouraged the growth of monopolies in return. So, I mean, really, bribes, or rather known as boodle, this sort of graft is definitely political corruption. And the politicians, these party bosses, are going to use their authority for personal gain. So here's how bad the corruption was. Okay, this happened under Boss Tweed here. The corruption was breathtaking in its breadth and baldness. A carpenter was paid $360,750, which is the equivalent of $4.9 million in 2004 for a month's worth of labor in a building with very little woodwork. Mind you, this is all when they're building the courthouse in New York City. A furniture contractor received $179,729 for 3 tables and 40 chairs. The plasterer, Andrew Garvey, got $133,187 for 2 days' worth of work. Tweed, when he even profited from this too. Profited from the financial interest in the Massachusetts quarry that provided the courthouse's marble. And when the city investigates as to why it's taking so long to build this courthouse, it's going to spend $7,718 to print a report. And that printing company owned by Boss Tweed. Dude. You know, each of these people, that carpenter, furniture contractor, plasterer, marble quarry, are all giving kickbacks to Boss Tweed in thanks for getting them that government contract. So, Lewis Hine is the one who's going to photograph child labor. And this happens more so during the Progressive era than the Gilded Age. But I mean, the National Child Labor Committee is going to tell Lewis Hine, go around these factories, photograph child labor so people can see the true problem of it. Because, I mean, look how tiny these kids are, and they're working. So, Hines's photographs are definitely going to alert the public that, yeah, child labor is a problem. We should be pushing for things like education for these kids and get them out of the factories. So, these photographs are so influential that by the early 1900s, 28 states are going to have laws regulating child labor. So here are the scope of a lot of the child labor photographs. And yeah, he's going to photograph kids who lost arms and legs. Kids who don't have shoes. Kids who are so tiny. And yeah, working so hard at the various factories or coal mines, textile mills. I mean, yeah, people are really going to be affected by these photographs that they see from Louis Hine. Especially the ones from the coal mines. So not only are they seeing photographs from Louis Hine about the kids in the coal mines, they're also reading about it from John Spargo. John Spargo is going to move to the United States in 1901, and with his book, The Bitter Cry of the Children, he's going to detail the plight of the working class children. Here's a quote. "Work in the coal breakers is exceedingly hard and dangerous. Crouched over the chutes, the boys sit hour after hour picking out the pieces of slate and other refuse from the coal as it rushes past to the washers. From the cramped position they have to assume, most of them become more or less deformed and bent-backed like old men. The coal is hard, and accidents to the hands, such as cuts, broken or crushed fingers, are common among the boys. Sometimes there is a worse accident. A terrified shriek is heard, and a boy is mangled and torn in the machinery, or disappears in the chute to be picked out later, smothered and dead. Clouds of dust fill the breakers and are inhaled by the boys, laying the foundation for asthma and miners' consumption." I mean, look at that. Look at their faces. You could see the coal ash on their faces. They're breathing that in every day. So no wonder your average life expectancy of a coal miner, child labor coal miner, is 16 years old. And these are the kids in the coal mines. So with Ray Stannard Baker, he's going to attack the racial divide in America with his book, Following the Color Line, an account of Negro citizenship in the American democracy. So he's going to bring to light some of these issues like political leadership down south, Jim Crow laws, lynching, and poverty. That's not to say the African American community didn't do the same thing with its own muckrakers. We will get into that later on as this lecture goes when we address the African American community. But Ray Stannard Baker is one to also address these problems. So, reform has to begin. It has to start grassroots. So that's why reform has to start at the municipal level. And what we're talking about is with municipal corruption. We need to address these problems. We need to address city services such as water and gas that were sold to the politicians' friends who charge higher prices for them. We need to address these mayors and city councils who are for sale through corruption and greed. We need to address the streets that were unpaved and filled with trash, and schools that were in disarray and disrepair, and even the police and civil servants who were corrupt and took bribes and payoffs. We need to address all of that because we've let the cities go. The cities grew too fast for local governments to handle them, so that's why people like Boss Tweed and the political machine stepped up, and the corruption followed with them. We didn't know how to handle this rapid influx from European immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and the strain that it put on the resources of the city. So businessmen are closely aligned with the city bosses, and it makes it incredibly hard to fight this corruption in the cities. But there's a couple of things we need to do. We need to go ahead and form national municipal leagues. We need our goals to be in mind that we want to address this failing and corrupt local governments by using direct democracy tools, by reforming laws and getting rid of stuff like, where people didn't have the right to a secret ballot. We need to get rid of that. So they're calling for reform. And some of the things that they're calling for is to end the private ownership of gas and water monopolies, a commission-style government, so that experts are appointed to the heads of the commissions, or a council and city management approach to government, where elected council members set the laws and an appointed city manager runs the different departments of the city. So what helps to usher in these reforms is that strong progressive mayors are being elected at this time. Mayors like Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones. He's a progressive businessman who turns mayor in Toledo, Ohio. And he's going to build playgrounds for the kids to play safely, golf courses, offer free kindergarten and night school for adults, and set up a homeless shelter. Seth Lowe, the mayor of Brooklyn, and later a mayor of New York City, is also going to, use his time in fighting for honest and efficient municipal government. And another muckraker who brings to light all of these, we talked about him, Lincoln Steffans, with the Shame of Cities. He's going to call for this formation of good government. And here's his quote: "In all cities, the better classes, the businessmen, are the sources of corruption, but they are so rarely pursued and caught that we do not fully realize once the trouble comes." So his groups, groups inspired by Lincoln Steffans, are going to attack this corruption, demand the reform in city government. God, the corruption was such a huge problem. Dishonest business had just basically controlled all of these services, like your utilities, like gas, water, sewage, public transportation, and electricity. So again, enough is enough. We need to take control of the utilities, take away the private ownership of them, and instead entrust the ownership in the cities so that they could provide lower rates for the people. And cities themselves are going to find out very quickly that they need to change their ways when disaster strikes. So the two areas of disaster we're going to look at is going to be Galveston and Dayton, Ohio. Because what happens in Galveston, Texas, is the hurricane of 1900. This hurricane was the biggest on record for this area and one of the most deadliest in the country ever. We're talking like Katrina levels. So this hurricane that hits directly in Galveston, Texas in 1900, the waves are higher than 15 feet. The winds howled at 130 miles per hour. And by the time the storm passed, more than 8,000 people were dead. Countless were injured, and half of the island's homes had been swept away. To give you guys perspective, Galveston was a bigger city than Houston at the time. And it was almost completely wiped out. Bodies were seen being swept ashore, miles and miles and miles away down the coast. So, the Commission Plan was a direct result of the Galveston Hurricane. The city was fearful that it would never recover to the prosperity that it had under the leadership of the incumbent city council, which was a group of wealthy businessmen who devised this plan to have a governor appoint the commission to govern the city during the rebuilding period. So they switched to this commission style of government, also known as the Galveston Plan, and it's one of the three basic forms of municipal government that we have today now. So under the Commission Plan, what we have is voters select a small governing commission, usually in charge of different areas of the city, on an at-large basis. And these commissioners will basically run these areas. They'll be responsible for taxation, appropriations, ordinances, and other functions. So each commissioner is also in charge of an aspect of municipal affairs, whether it be public works, finance, or public safety. And one of the commissioners is designated as a chairman or mayor, but basically their function is to preside over meetings and serve in a ceremonial capacity. The real power is with the commission. So another area that was struck by disaster, of course, is Dayton, Ohio, with this big flood that we see here. So this happens to Dayton, Ohio in 1913, and, what they're going to call for is a city management style of government, to have a college-educated, highly paid professional that's hired by the city council to run the city, which lowers this risk of corruption and prevents problems like these from happening. So at the state level, we're going to have progressive minded politicians like Robert LaFollette, who comes up with the Wisconsin idea. And the Wisconsin idea is what he institutes in 1900. This is his platform of, pushing for higher railroad taxes, tax reform, regulation of corporations, political democracy, and a direct primary, which was totally different at that time. So he develops these new techniques. The first one is the Wisconsin idea, where he's going to use professors from the University of Wisconsin to draft bills and administer the new state regulatory apparatus that was created by these new laws. The second innovation he comes up with is the public reading of the roll call in districts in which legislatures had opposed his reform proposal. So basically calling out the people going up against the reform. And with all of these new methods, he's going to secure passage of several progressive laws in the state of Wisconsin. The direct primary is definitely going to have an effect on all of this, and civil service reform as well. So Wisconsin is going to lead the way with progressive era reforms on the state level. So here's what we're talking about. The Australian secret ballot. So nobody could know who you're voting for. So that eliminates a lot of the power from the city bosses and the party bosses, who would send these hired thugs to follow you into the polling place to make sure you're voting for their candidate. That can't happen anymore with the secret ballots. The initiative. We saw this idea with the populace, but essentially it's going to allow the public to petition state governments to consider bills that the people want passed, as well as the referendum and the recall. These are all part of the Populist Party platform. The referendum is going to give voters the right to decide if a proposed state law should be passed. And the recall. The voters have the right to remove an elected representative from office. As well, the direct primary. So candidates for an office are chosen by the voters instead of by fellow politicians or the party bosses. And most importantly, the direct election of senators. Because senators were not directly picked by the people at this time. They were appointed by their buddies in the state legislatures. Now, the people directly vote for the senators of their state. This is the direct election of senators that takes place with the 17th Amendment. So there we go, guys. You've now seen local municipal reform and reform at the state level. So for our next lecture, we are going to be talking about reform at the national level. So this is when we get into politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So hope you guys stuck with me on this one. I know we went through it rapid fire, but seriously, guys, we got this. We got this progressive era reform. So all right, I will see you guys later. Bye.